So let's go ahead and talk about nulls and null coalescing. You remember when we talked about value types versus reference types, and we already talked about classes and objects. And basically all this information is going to help you understand what nulls are and understand why we need to do null coalescing. But if you remember, when we're talking about value types versus reference types, we have created a custom type person, and the person was the pointer. The variable name was the pointer that pointed to the heap where the actual data was sitting. Now, what we can say is that the pointer is actually pointing to nothing. And we can do that by using null. Null just means no object. So let's go ahead and do that. First, let me say person equals new person. Now I already have that type created. And it's a little bit different this time. I'll show you how. You can see that there is a constructor, and we'll be talking about constructors a little later, but it has two properties on it. And what this means is that we can create our person using first name and last name. We are required to pass in a first name and last name as arguments in order to create this object, instantiate that object. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I will say John Smith. So there you go. And that's the object. Then I will say console, right line, and I will access the first name from the instantiated object. And let's see how this works. So it says John, which is great. However, we can say null. And that would mean that the pointer person is now pointing to no object. Yet, nothing is underlined red, because this is not going to be a compile time error, meaning that when our programming is being made and converted down to machine code, nothing looks wrong, because person is still pointing to something. It's pointing to something. In this case, it's null. It's no object. But then from that instantiated object, we are using a property. So nothing looks wrong. It's just that it will be a runtime error, because since there is no object that has been instantiated from the class, we cannot use a property from that non-instantiated class. So once we run the program, we will see that we will get a null exception error. Let me show you what I mean by that. See? Null reference exception. So that just basically means that there was no object to access anything from. And this actually could be a very confusing bug to look for in your code. In this case, we only have 2 lines. But imagine if there was an enterprise application and you had thousands of lines, and let's say one method was returning an object, a certain custom type, and then another method that was using that method expected that the object was always going to be instantiated. But for whatever reason, if it returned that custom type as null, and we did this type of thing where we're trying to use properties from it, then it would surely give us a null reference exception. And in order to avoid stuff like that, what we can do is use null coalescing. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say that method that we're talking about, the hypothetical method, gave us a null for the person custom type. What we could then do is, whenever we're getting that back, we could just say, or even before getting that back, the method that is returning could do this. That's basically depends on whatever decision the person writing that code was making, but here's how we can do null coalescing if we were in that situation. So I will say new person, and I will say person, and then I will say new person, default person. So see what happened? The person now is going to be checked and validated. This is our null coalescing operator. And this is just another operator that takes an operands and then returns a value. So in this case, it says, listen, if the person that is on my left side, if that is null, then I'm going to return you my default that is passed into me. But if person is not a null, then I will just return the person back. So it's essentially a check. It's a null check. And if it sees that it's a null, it will give you a default version that you specified. Otherwise, it will return that value back. So let's give this a shot and see if it will work. So in this case, we're expecting it to say first name as default. So let's see if that'll work. And the reason why I broke is because I did not use new person. So this totally makes sense. But if I said new person, you can see that it will work. Default. Great. Now let's try one other thing. I will say new person, so it's not a null anymore. I'll say it's still John Smith. Now it's no longer null, so we should be expecting John as first name, even though it's still the new person. So you see, John. So null coalescing is a very great technique that we will be using when creating our word unscrambler.